Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to this video series on Windows Server 2012, Managing Security. One of the fundamental design goals of Active Directory is to define a single centralized repository of users and information resources. Active Directory records information about all of the users, computers, and resources on your network. Each domain acts as a logical boundary, and members of the domain, including workstations, servers, and domain controllers, share information about the objects within them. The information stored within Active Directory determines which resources are accessible to which users through the use of permissions that are assigned to Active Directory objects. You can control all aspects of network security. You should be sure that you have implemented appropriate access control settings for the file system, network devices, and other resources. Let's look at the various components of network security, which include working with security principles and managing security and permissions, access control lists, ACLs, user account control, UAC, and access control entries. Understanding security principles. Security principles are Active Directory objects that are assigned security identifiers, SIDs. An SID is a unique identifier that is used to manage any object to which permissions can be assigned. Security principles are assigned permissions to perform certain actions and access certain network resources. The following basic types of Active Directory objects serve as security principles. User accounts identify individual users on your network by including information such as the user's name and their password. User accounts are the fundamental unit of security administration groups. There are two types of groups, the security groups and distribution groups. Both types can contain user accounts. System administrators use security groups to ease the management of security permissions. They use distribution groups, on the other hand, solely to send email. Distribution groups are not security principles. You will see the details of groups in the next section. Computer accounts identify which client computers are members of particular domains because these computers participate in Active Directory database. System administrators can manage security settings that affect the computer. They use computer accounts to determine whether a computer can join a domain and for authentication purposes. And you'll see later in this chapter, system administrators can also place restrictions on certain computer settings to increase security. These settings apply to the computer and therefore also apply to any user who's using it, regardless of the permissions granted to the user account. Note that other objects such as OUs, organizational units, do not function as security principles. What this means is that you can apply certain settings such as group policy on all of the objects within an OU. However, you cannot specifically set permissions with respect to OU. The purpose of OUs is to organize Active Directory objects logically based on business needs, add a needed level of control for security, and create an easier way to delegate. You can manage security by performing the following actions with security principles. You can assign them permissions to access various network resources. You can give them user rights. You can track their actions through auditing. The major types of security principles, user accounts, group, and computer accounts, form the basis of the Active Directory security architecture. As a system administrator, you will likely spend a portion of your time managing permissions for these objects. Users and groups are two types of fundamental security principles employed for security administration. In the following sections, you'll learn how users and groups interact. You'll also learn about the different types of groups you can create. Types of groups. When dealing with groups, you should make the distinction between local security principles and domain security principles as follows. Local users and groups You use local users and groups to assign the permissions necessary to access the local machine. For example, you may assign the permissions you need to reboot a domain controller to a specific domain local account. Domain users and groups, on the other hand, are used through the domain. These objects are available on any of the computers within the Active Directory domain and between domains that have a trust relationship. Here are the two main types of groups used in Active Directory. Security groups are considered security principals. They contain user accounts, computers, or groups to make administration simpler. System administrators usually grant permissions to group. This allows you to change permissions easily at the Active Directory level instead of at the level of the resource on which permissions are assigned. You can also place Active Directory contact objects within security groups, but security permissions will not apply to them. Distribution groups are not considered security principals because they do not have SIDs. As mentioned earlier, they are used only for the purpose of sending email messages. You can add users to distribution groups just as you would add them to security groups. You can also place distribution groups within OUs so that they are easier to manage. You will find them useful. For example, if you need to send email messages to an entire department or business within business unit within Active Directory. Understanding the difference between security and distribution groups is important in an Active Directory environment. For the most part, system administrators use security groups for the daily administration of permissions. On the other hand, system administrators who are responsible for maintaining email distribution lists generally use distribution groups to group members of departments and business units logically. A system administrator can also email all of the users within a security group, but to do so, they would have to specify the email address for their accounts. When you're working with Windows Server 2003, Server 2008, Server 2008 R2, Server 2012, and Windows Server 2012 R2, functional level domains, you can convert security groups to or from distribution groups. Group scope, in addition to being classified by type, each group is given a specific scope. The scope of a group defines two characteristics. First, it determines the level of security that applies to a group. Second, it determines which users can be added to the group. Group scope is an important concept in network environments because it ultimately defines which resources users are able to access. The three types of group scopes are as follows. Domain local. The scope of domain local groups extends as far as the local domain. When you're using the Active Directory users and computers tool, domain local accounts apply to the computer for which you are viewing information. Domain local groups are used to assign permissions to local resources such as files and printers. They contain domain locals, global groups, universal groups, and user groups global. The scope of global groups is limited to a single domain. Global groups may contain any of the users who are part of the Active Directory domain in which the global groups reside, or other global groups. Global groups are often used for managing domain security permissions based on job functions. For example, if you need to specify permissions for the engineering department, you could create one or more global groups such as engineering managers and engineering developers. You could then assign security permissions to each group. Universal groups can contain accounts or other universal groups for any domains within an Active Directory forest. Therefore, system administrators use them to manage security across domains. When you are managing multiple domains It is often helpful to group global groups within universal groups. For instance, if you have an engineering global group in the research.stellacom.com domain and an engineering global group in the asia.stellacom.com domain, you can create a universal all engineers group that contains both of the global groups. Now, whenever you must assign security permissions to all engineers within the organization, you need only assign permissions to all engineers universal group. For domain controllers to process authentication between domains, information about the membership of universal groups is stored in the global catalog GC. Keep in mind, if you ever plan to place users directly into universal groups and bypass global groups, because all of the users will be enumerated in the GC, which will impact size and performance. Fortunately, universal group credentials are cached on domain controllers that universal group members use to log on. This process is called universal group membership caching. The domain controller obtains the cached data whenever universal group members log on, and then it is retained on the domain controller for 8 hours by default. This is especially useful for smaller locations such as branch offices that run less expensive domain controllers. Most domain controllers at these locations cannot store a copy of the entire GC, and frequent calls to the nearest GC would require an inordinate amount of network traffic. Whenever you create a new group using the Active Directory Users and Computers tool, you must specify the scope of the group. Figure 7.1 shows the new object group dialog box and the available options for the group scope. Changing group scope, however, can be helpful when your security administration or business needs change. You can change group scope easily using the Active Directory Users and Computer tools. To do so, access the properties of the group as shown in Figure 7.2. You can make a group scope change by clicking one of the options. So here you see Figure 7.1, the new object group dialog box. Figure 7.2, the sales security groups properties dialog box. Built-in domain local groups. System administrators use built-in domain local groups to perform administrative functions on the local server. Because these have pre-assigned permissions and privileges, they allow system administrators to assign common management functions easily. Figure 7.3 shows the default built-in groups that are available on a Windows Server 2012 or 2 domain controller. The list of built-in groups includes some of the following account operators. These users can create and modify domain user and group accounts. Members of this group are generally responsible for the daily administration of Active Directory. Administrators, by default, some of the administrators group are given full permissions to perform any functions within the Active Directory domain on the local computer. This means they can access all files and resources that reside on any server within the domain. As you can see, this is a powerful account. In general, you should restrict the number of users who are included in this group because most common administration functions do not require this level of access. Backup operators. One of the problems associated with backing up data in a secure network environment is that you need to provide a way to bypass standard file system security so that you can copy files. Although you could place users in the administrators group, doing so usually provides more permission than necessary. Members of the backup operators group can bypass standard file system security for the purpose of backup and recovery only. They cannot, however, directly access or open files within the file system. Generally, backup software applications and data use the permissions assigned to the backup operators group Certificate Service DCOM. Access members of the Certified Service DCOM access group can connect to certificate authority servers in the enterprise. Cryptographic operators. Members of the cryptographic operators group are authorized to perform cryptographic operations. Cryptography allows the use of codes to convert data, which then allows a specific recipient to read it using a key. Guests. Typically, you use the guests group to provide access to resources that generally do not require security. For example, if you have a network that shares, okay. For example, if you have a network shared that provides files that should be made available to all network users, you can assign permissions to allow members of the guests group to access those files. Print operators. By default, members of the print operators group are given permissions to administer all of the printers within a domain. This includes common functions such as changing the priority of print jobs and deleting them from the print queue. Replicator. The replicator group allows files to be replicated among the computers in a domain. You can add accounts used for replication-related tasks to this group to provide those accounts with the permissions they need to keep files synchronized across multiple computers. Server operators. A common administrative task is managing server configuration. Members of the server operators group are granted permissions they need to manage services, shares, and other system settings. Users. The user's built-in domain local group is used to administer security for most network accounts. Usually, you don't give this group many permissions, and you use it to apply security settings for most employees within an organization. Windows Server 2012 R2 also includes many different default groups, which you can find in the users folder as shown in figure 7.4. These groups are of varying scopes, including domain, local, global, and universal groups. You will see the details of these groups in the next section. Figure 7.4, contents of the default users folder. 3 important user accounts are created during the promotion of a domain controller described here. Administrator account. The administrator account is assigned the password a system administrator provides during the promotion process, and it has full permissions to perform all actions within the domain. Guest account. The guest account is disabled by default. The purpose of the guest account is to provide anonymous access to users who do not have individual logon and password to use within the domain. Although the guest account might be useful in some situations, it is generally recommended that this account be disabled to increase security. K or BTGT or Key Distribution Center Service account. Only the operating system uses the K or BTGT or Key Distribution Center Service account for Kerberos authentication while it is using dcpromo.exe. This account is disabled by default. Unlike other accounts, the K or BTGT account cannot be used to log onto the domain, and therefore it does not need to be enabled. Since only the operating system uses this account, you do not need to worry about hackers gaining access by using this account. Predefined global groups. As mentioned earlier in this chapter, you use global groups to manage permissions at the domain level. Members of each of these groups can perform specific tasks related to managing Active Directory. The following predefined global groups are installed in the users folder. Cert Publishers. Certificates are used to increase security by allowing for strong authentication methods. User accounts are placed within the certificate publishers group if they must publish security certificates. Generally, Active Directory security services use these accounts. Domain computers. All of the computers that are members of the domain are generally members of the domain computers group. This includes any workstation or servers that have joined the domain, but it does not include the domain controllers. Domain admins. Members of the domain admins group have full permissions to manage all of the Active Directory objects of this domain. This is a powerful account. Therefore, you should restrict its membership only to those users who require full permissions. Domain controllers. All of the domain controllers for a given domain are generally included within the domain controllers group. Domain guests. Generally, by default, members of the domain guests group are given minimal permissions with respect to resources. System administrators may place user accounts in this group if they require only basic access or temporary permissions within the domain. Domain users. The domain users group usually contains all of the user accounts for the given domain. This group is generally given basic permissions to resources that do not require higher levels of security. A common example is a public file share. Enterprise admins. Members of the enterprise admins group are given full permissions to perform actions within the entire forest. This includes functions such as managing trust relationships and adding new domains to trees and forests. Group policy creator owners. Members of the group policy creators owners group are able to create and modify group policy settings for objects within the domain. This allows them to enable security settings on OUs and the objects they contain. Schema admins. Members of the Schema admins group are given permissions to modify the Active Directory schema. As a member of the Schema admins, you can create additional field of information for user accounts. This is a powerful function because any changes to the schema will be propagated to all of the domains and domain controllers within the Active Directory forest. Furthermore, you cannot undo changes to the schema. In addition to these groups, you can create new ones for specific services and applications that are installed on the server. Specifically, services that run on domain controllers and servers will be created on security groups with domain local scope. For example, if a domain controller is running the DNS service, the DNS admins and the DNS update proxy groups become available. In addition, there are two read-only domain controller or RODC local groups, the allowed RODC password replication and the denied RODC password replication groups. Similarly, if you install the DHCP service, it automatically creates the DHCP users and DHCP administrators group. The purpose of these groups depend on the functionality of the applications being installed. So I'm going to leave it here today for this video. If you like listening, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you.